lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm filming my wrap up for January for everything I read in the first month of the year. So this time round we're going to go in order of like preference and kind of which books I enjoyed more. I read 8 books throughout the month and there were a fair number of kind of meh titles in there, but there were also a couple of really incredible ones, so I want to focus on those first. The first book that I finished that I thought was absolutely amazing is Black and British by David Olusoga. This is, as the title suggests, a huge non-fiction history of black people within Britain, going from kind of the very early black Romans and kind of the early Afro-Roman kind of remains that we have, and the work that is being done to kind of really reevaluate some of the earlier discoveries we have to kind of not have such a white-centric lens on them. Going through to discuss Black Tudors, which is something I have read a little bit about before, and then really looking very in depth at England / Britain's kind of place within the slave trade, the transatlantic kind of slave triangle, and then work by abolitionists both in terms of trying to abolish the slave trade and slavery, and then connections with colonialism carrying all the way up through to modern day, looking at the interactions and kind of role of the black communities within the First and Second World War, and also specifically the colonies within both of those wars. As you can imagine, with a book that covers such a huge, ridiculously expansive spread of time, it is incredibly long and incredibly detailed, and I think David Olusoga does an amazing job of giving enough kind of callbacks and sort of references so it's easier to keep some of the bigger themes in your head, as well as sort of the more nitty-gritty of what was going on in those particular decades or centuries. Now, with something that is so expansive, you're not going to get an in-depth look of any particular one individual, and there is a lot of discussion of the various kind of white people involved within abolition as well as the various black people. So if you were looking for a really kind of in-depth look at some of those areas, you are going to be potentially disappointed with this read. It is far more of a broad, general, sweeping look, but I think it's an incredible feat of history. It's a really important read. It's a fantastic read where I learned so much and found it so fascinating. I think he has a really wonderful writing style, and I definitely want to go on to read some of the books that he recommends at the back, to potentially go on and see some more of his work in particular, and just generally I feel like it's the strongest sense I actually have of like the history of my country in general, obviously with this lens of focusing on the black individuals in our country, but like he says in the book, you know, black history is not separate from white history, it is history, and the kind of strong actual sense I have of like Britain's place in the world over those centuries this is probably the most confident I've ever felt in my kind of historical knowledge as such. Another book that was an absolutely cracking read, and I kind of figured it would be, is The Kraken Awakes, or Wakes even, by John Wyndham. John Wyndham is an absolutely iconic sci-fi writer from the 50s, and this is a wonderful book that is looking at some kind of terrifying aliens that creep up from the sea and pitch an invasion against the world. It's relatively similar in some ways to his book The Day of the Triffids, but this time it's focusing on kind of an aquatic threat rather than a plant-based threat. And I think, like with so much of what John Wyndham writes, he's so on the money for how governments react, how countries react, and how kind of individuals react to some big national threat, and sort of the unknown and the otherness of whatever that unknown is. There were a few points that were far too close to home when one of the characters has a bit of a rant about how the government and like national governments will handle this sort of big aquatic threat that is both a threat to lives but also a massive threat to kind of trade and the very important shipping trade that is happening at the time. And that one definitely rung far too close to home now in the 3rd lockdown that my country is currently going through, and discussions about opening up businesses and the economy versus human life. So that was one that felt a little fresh, but other than that I think it's fantastic. John Wyndham is a wonderful writer. This is the 5th book of his that I've read. I think I'd probably rank it in my top 3 of what he's he's written that I've read. Very strong, and I actually enjoyed it more than Day of the Triffids, so definitely worth checking out. I think that the underwater aliens are terrifying. Another book I had a really good time with is Witchmark by L Polk. This is the first in kind of a historical fantasy series, which is set in like a parallel university kind of thing, which is definitely mirroring a lot of our own, but a lot of the names have changed, and it's loosely based on their conception of the First World War. And our main character is a doctor. He's a surgeon who is working in mental health, but he's also a magician, and he has to hide this from various people in his life. And it is about the kind of class struggles happening with the magicians in power, and the distinction they're drawing between the warlocks who are in power and the magicians who are basically lower class people with magic who end up being kind of used and abused in this system. It's a really fun, interesting series. It does a lot of very big world building at the in the first book, but I generally had a really good time, and I loved the romance in it. I thought it was an absolutely wonderful slow burn gay romance that I deeply appreciated, and I'm definitely going to be checking out the next book in the series, although I believe the next book in the series actually follows our main character's sister, and is kind of doing that like sparking off with some secondary characters rather than following on with our current main characters. But yeah, really beautiful, lovely blend of history and fantasy, and just generally really good fun. I started a new graphic novel series this month, and I genuinely really enjoyed it, and this is Lazarus. So this is volume 1, and basically it's some kind of sort of post-apocalyptic world where the rich and famous, their family, one of their family members is kind of a genetically and kind of scientifically engineered superhuman who is charged with protecting the family from all sorts of horrible, terrible people who want to do horrible, terrible things to them. So it's following this particular family. The Lazarus is this kind of engineered character in this family, and we're following this one particular family and the woman who is their Lazarus, and sort of the kind of hidden kind of political inner workings of this particular family. It didn't do a crazy amount with volume 1, but I really enjoyed the artwork. I think it's absolutely stunning. I think also it had some really incredibly choreographed fight scenes, and was just generally really kind of gritty and dark and brutal, and reminded me a lot of Revival, which is one of my favourite graphic novel series that I definitely need to get around to finishing. So this was surprisingly enjoyable. A book that I had kind of a bit of a mixed response to is The Unfinished Palazzo by Judith Mackrell. This is focused on a particular building in Venice. It is the Unfinished Palazzo is its name, and it is basically was built by a particular sort of member of the landed gentry within Italy in the kind of the turn of the century, and then it ends up being owned by 3 different women, and this particular book is looking at those 3 different women. When I say it's looking at these 3 different women, it's actually mainly focused on 2 of them, and the middle woman is almost like crowbarred in there because the author felt the need to kind of continue with sort of chronologically who owned this place, and you kind of feel like she really doesn't care much about the middle one. It's a much shorter bit that we spend with her, because the kind of first woman and the last woman are both people who were very heavily involved in the art community within Europe, and so I think she's more interested in exploring that particular side of things. So the women are Louisa Cassetti, Doris Castle-Rose, and Peggy Guggenheim. And Peggy Guggenheim was one that I was actually interested in, and the reason why I bought this. It's the kind of book where sections of it were definitely more interesting than others. That's so often the case with non-fiction, and even though it's called The Unfinished Palazzo, the palazzo itself barely features in the book because many of the women didn't really own it for very long, and it wasn't particularly core part of their lives. But you could kind of tell that the author was kind of pitching this to try and tie all of these things together to kind of justify the existence of the non-fiction book, and it felt a little bit like a marketing gimmick rather than actually like a strong thread through. She also does this thing that I really don't like that non-fiction writers do, which is where she tries to diagnose one of the women in particular with some kind of different medical terms that I do not think it is appropriate to try and do, like the act of a historian looking back on somebody from history and then being like, oh, based on everything we know about her, they clearly were. And so she has all sorts of kind of she suggests that the woman is autistic, which it's fine to discuss these things as potentially kind of a speculative option, but she kind of suggests it very early on and then takes it as like almost like a confirmed diagnosis throughout the rest of that section of the woman. And she's a little bit kind of judgmental and harsh in places, so I didn't overly like the authorial voice. I think that she was too strong in her opinions of these women throughout the book. But if you are a big fan of art history and you want to know more about kind of art and the art world within Europe from like, what is it, kind of the early 1900s to kind of like through the war to sort of the 1950s and 60s, I do think this is a great book for kind of getting to see a lot of the very familiar faces and characters that you'll know from that world. And it's interesting because it's looking at the art collector side of things rather than the artist side of things, and looking at the number of characters and people that are important within the art community to make something like this kind of thrive and survive beyond just the artists themselves. So still an interesting read, but unfortunately I just don't think that the author did as good a job as I think somebody else might have done, and it felt a little bit kind of thrown together in places. A historical fiction that I read that I really just wasn't that bothered by was The Book of Fires by Jane Borodale. This is a book set in 1750s, and it's about a young girl who runs away because she's found out that she's pregnant, and she really does not want to marry the bloke who ended up making her pregnant. So she steals some money and runs away and finds a job being an apprentice to a firework maker in one of the bigger cities. And then it is about some of like her struggling with her pregnancy, and then also trying to kind of work out what she's going to do, and then also learning how to make fireworks. I think this book, the strongest part of it is when we're discussing how fireworks were made historically and kind of some of the science behind that. The rest of it just didn't feel particularly realistic or sensible to me. Her plans for how to deal with her pregnancy felt very absurd and ridiculous. The characters felt very flat and two-dimensional, and there were definitely some people crowbarred in that added basically nothing to the storyline. So just generally I kind of got left with a feeling of like, what was the point in this? And then the way that it ended felt very neat and convenient, and a bit of a kind of cop-out way of ending everything, and just overall I was not that impressed. However, if you like historical fiction, maybe you'll enjoy this one, and it was kind of cool reading the various descriptions of fireworks, so yay for fireworks. I read book 23, I think, of the Animorphs series. 25 according to my notes. Who knows anymore. This is by A Applegate, and it's a middle grade series that was written in the 90s, and is basically about 5 kids who have the ability to morph into animals, and they're in some kind of very big intergalactic battle where Earth is the battleground for it. Apparently this is the point in the series where ghostwriters got quite heavily involved, and I didn't realise this until after reading the book and was like, why did that feel so weird? And like, the plot didn't follow any real kind of conventions I expect from these. The characters felt very like stereotypes themselves. What is happening here? And then I read a bunch of Goodreads reviews, and they were like, yeah, you can tell the ghostwriters got involved. I was like, oh, it makes sense now. So that kind of put me off a little bit, and I know that ghostwriters are now involved for the next few, so I'm gonna hopefully just try and blitz through them as quickly as I can at some point when I'm feeling really tired, because you can kind of tell that the quality is sort of taking a bit of a nosedive. But I do think that the series is strong overall, and I'm absolutely determined to finish everything, because I know it has a really cool ending, because I read that as a kid, but I didn't really read a lot of the build up to it, so I'm really excited to fill in those gaps. So I will commit to finishing this series at some point. I just know I've got a couple of like rough, fairly dull books ahead, but they're only like 100 to 150 pages long, and they're middle grade. They take me like an hour to read, if that, so we're fine. And then the final book that I read that I really didn't enjoy is Emma by Jane Austen. I gave this like 2.5 stars. I think I rounded it up to 3 on my Goodreads, and just nothing happens in this book. Like, it's a classic, and it is essentially following our main character Emma Woodhouse, I believe is her surname, and essentially she is a bit of a matchmaker in her kind of social circle, but she often does it basically terribly wrong, and she gets the wrong idea about a lot of different people, and her meddling creates more problems than it solves. And it's about her kind of learning her comeuppances and sort of finally meeting a man and settling down, etc, etc. And just, I didn't really enjoy it. I felt like there were huge stretches where nothing really happened. I felt like that there was kind of a lot of wittering from the characters, and I didn't particularly like Emma, and I didn't think even after she'd gone through sort of her character arc and learnt to sort of mind her manners and like not put so much on other people and kind of learn society places a bit more, like she was still really annoying as a person. And I understand that this is an important book when it comes to kind of the literary canon. It's one of apparently some of the earliest examples of like the unreliable narrator, because what Emma is describing happening is not what actually is happening. I don't know if that's genuinely like true or not. Like my knowledge of the literary canon in general is not strong enough to be able to kind of testify, but that's what the internet said. But basically it just felt like a bit of a drag. So I finished it because by the time I'd realised that I wasn't really enjoying it, I didn't have much of the audiobook left. But I kind of wish I hadn't. Kind of wish I'd just DNF'd it, because it felt like a big waste of time, and it definitely slowed down my reading a lot this month, where I just wasn't bothered by listening to it. I do like Jane Austen. I've read 2 of Jane Austen's books before this one and deeply enjoyed them, so it's not put me off her as an author. But if the next one I read from her isn't anywhere near as enjoyable, I think it might be something that I maybe like walk away from. So there you have it. Those are the 8 books that I read in January. It's been a slower start to the year, but I do just have to accept that it's going to be a slower year because I'm actually working full time again. So I'm trying to get less caught up and stressed about that. I also have a bunch of books on the go at the moment that I've definitely kind of carried over from the end of January to the beginning of February, and if I really like set my mind to it, I probably could have just finished off a couple more books at the end of January rather than starting a few of my February TBR already. But I was feeling really excited about my February TBR and I just wanted to kind of jump in with a few different things, so I just felt like reading what I wanted to read rather than worrying about finishing books for a specific deadline for wrap-ups, which I'm trying not to get hung up on because it definitely slows down my reading at the end of the month and is not something I should worry about. So I think I've got about 4, maybe 5 on the go at the moment, all of which I'm generally enjoying, which is really nice. So yeah, let me know what you think of some of these books. Have you read any of them before? Let me know everything in the comments down below. Have a wonderful reading week and I will chat to you soon. Bye!